There are roads where cargo doesn't just disappear. It gets replaced with things that should never see daylight. My name is Benjamin, and for 24 years, I've been hauling freight up and down the most dangerous highway in North America. The Dalton Highway, what truckers call the Haul Road, stretches 414 miles from Fairbanks to Deadhorse, cutting through wilderness so remote and unforgiving that a broken-down truck can become a frozen tomb in hours. It's a road built for the oil industry, maintained by desperation, and traveled by drivers who understand that civilization ends at milepost 1 and doesn't resume until you reach the Arctic Ocean. But nothing in over 2 decades of running the Haul Road prepared me for that February night when I discovered that some cargo thefts aren't about money. They're about replacing what you're hauling with something so horrifying that your truck becomes an unwitting delivery system for nightmares that wear human faces. Since that night, I inspect every seal, every box, every inch of cargo space before I leave a shipper, and again every 100 miles until I reach my destination. The paranoia has cost me sleep, relationships, and most of my sanity, but it's also kept me alive in a business where cargo theft has evolved from simple robbery into something that resembles human trafficking, organ harvesting, and worse things that I try not to think about during the endless Arctic nights. I was 52 years old then, a lifelong bachelor who'd chosen the solitude of long-haul trucking over the complications of marriage and family. My father had been a construction worker on the original Trans-Alaska pipeline, and I'd grown up hearing stories about the brutal conditions, the impossible logistics, and the men who died building a highway through country that wasn't meant for human habitation. The Dalton Highway was my specialty, my obsession and my curse. Most truckers wouldn't touch it. The weather was too harsh, the distances too great, the margins for error too small. But I thrived on the challenge, the isolation, and the knowledge that I was one of only a few dozen drivers experienced enough to haul freight through Arctic conditions that could kill you in minutes if your truck broke down or you made a single mistake. My rig was a 2021 Peterbilt 389 with every cold weather modification known to trucking: block heaters, auxiliary power units, Arctic-rated tires, and enough emergency equipment to survive for a week in conditions where the temperature could drop to 60 below zero and the wind could strip flesh from bone in seconds. The truck was painted a distinctive bright red that stood out against the white landscape, making it easier for rescue aircraft to spot if I ran into trouble. That February run started in Fairbanks with what appeared to be a routine cargo load: construction materials and supplies for the Prudhoe Bay oil complex. The manifest listed steel beams, electrical components, insulation materials, and miscellaneous maintenance supplies totaling about 40,000 pounds. Standard industrial freight for the oil fields, nothing unusual or particularly valuable. The shipper was Arctic Supply Solutions, a logistics company that had been serving the North Slope oil operations for over 15 years. I'd hauled dozens of loads for them without incident, and their reputation for accurate manifests and proper cargo securing was excellent. The loading process was supervised by their warehouse manager, Frank Morrison, a former oil field worker who understood the critical importance of proper weight distribution and load securing for haul road conditions. But something felt wrong from the moment I backed up to their loading dock. The warehouse crew was different, faces I didn't recognize, workers who seemed nervous and avoided eye contact. Frank Morrison was nowhere to be seen, and when I asked about him, I was told he'd called in sick. The supervisor overseeing the loading was a thin, pale man named Stevens, who claimed to be Morrison's temporary replacement. Stevens was knowledgeable about the cargo and efficient in directing the loading process, but there was something about him that triggered every instinct I'd developed in over 2 decades of dealing with shippers, receivers, and the various criminals who preyed on the trucking industry. He watched me too closely, asked too many questions about my route and schedule, and seemed more interested in my truck's capabilities than in the cargo being loaded. But the manifest was legitimate, the seals were properly applied, and I had a delivery deadline that didn't allow time for paranoid speculation about warehouse personnel. I signed the paperwork, secured the cargo, and departed Fairbanks at 11 p.m. for the 14-hour drive to Deadhorse. The first 100 miles of the Dalton Highway passed through boreal forest and rolling hills, challenging but not yet the nightmare terrain of the Brooks Range and North Slope. The temperature was minus 25 degrees Fahrenheit with light snow, good conditions for February in interior Alaska. My truck was running smoothly, the cargo was riding well, and I settled into the rhythm that had sustained me through hundreds of haul road runs. At milepost 56, just past the Yukon River Bridge, I stopped for my first mandatory cargo inspection. DOT regulations required drivers hauling certain types of freight to inspect their loads at regular intervals, checking for shifting, damage, or other problems that could cause accidents on dangerous roads. I walked around the trailer with a flashlight, checking the tie-downs, examining the trailer walls for damage and looking for signs that the cargo had shifted during the first hour of driving. Everything appeared normal. The seals were intact, the trailer showed no signs of damage or tampering, and the weight distribution felt proper. But as I was completing the inspection, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were tire tracks in the snow beside my trailer, fresh tracks that hadn't been there when I'd stopped. Someone had approached my truck while I was conducting the inspection, walking around the trailer and then disappearing back into the darkness. I drew my .44 Magnum revolver and searched the area around my truck, but whoever had made the tracks was gone. The wilderness on both sides of the highway was impenetrable forest, and anyone familiar with the terrain could disappear completely within minutes. I checked the trailer seals again. They were intact and showed no signs of tampering, but the feeling of being watched, of being stalked through the Arctic wilderness, persisted as I continued north toward the Brooks Range. Every few miles, I would catch glimpses of headlights in my mirrors, distant lights that would appear briefly and then disappear, as if someone was following me but trying to remain undetected. At Coldfoot, milepost 175, I stopped at the truck stop for fuel and another cargo inspection. Coldfoot is the last real civilization on the haul road, a small complex of buildings including a truck stop, motel, and maintenance facility that serves as a refuge for drivers making the run to the North Slope. The place was nearly deserted, unusual for a Friday night when most drivers tried to complete their runs before weekend weather systems moved in. The attendant, an Inupiaq woman named Sarah, who'd been working at Coldfoot for over a decade, seemed nervous when I walked into the building. "You hauling for Arctic Supply Solutions?" she asked, glancing toward my truck. "Yeah. Why?" "You're the third driver today hauling their freight. The other two, something was wrong with their cargo." The words hit me like a physical blow. "What do you mean wrong?" Sarah glanced around to make sure we were alone, then leaned closer and lowered her voice. "Jimmy Kovac came through around noon, hauling what was supposed to be construction supplies from Arctic Supply. When he opened his trailer to check the load, some of the boxes had been opened and resealed. Inside, instead of the electrical components on his manifest, he found—" She paused, struggling with the words. "He found body parts, human body parts, preserved in some kind of chemical solution." The coffee cup in my hand began shaking so violently that I had to set it down. "What happened to Jimmy?" "He called the state troopers, but by the time they got here, someone had broken into his trailer and taken the boxes with the body parts, replaced them with the electrical components that were supposed to be there originally, made it look like Jimmy was hallucinating or lying." "And the second driver, Tom Brennan, same thing. Cargo that didn't match the manifest, boxes that had been opened and resealed. But when he tried to report it, his truck caught fire in the parking lot, burned completely, destroyed all the evidence. Tom barely escaped with his life. The pattern was clear and terrifying. Someone was using legitimate shipping companies to transport illegal cargo, then monitoring the drivers and eliminating evidence when the shipments were discovered. The remote location of the haul road made it perfect for such operations. Hundreds of miles from law enforcement, with wilderness areas where evidence could be disposed of permanently. "Sarah, I need you to call the Alaska State Troopers and tell them I'm conducting a cargo inspection. If something happens to me or my truck, they'll know where to start looking." She nodded and reached for the phone, but before she could dial, the lights in the truck stop went out. Emergency generators kicked in immediately, but in the few seconds of darkness, I heard the sound of truck doors slamming and engines starting outside. Through the windows, I could see vehicles moving in the parking lot, dark SUVs and pickup trucks with their headlights off, positioning themselves around my truck. Someone had been waiting for me to stop at Coldfoot, and now they were making their move. "Get down and stay away from the windows," I told Sarah, drawing my revolver. "Call for help on whatever frequency will reach the troopers." I moved to a window where I could observe my truck without being seen. The vehicles had formed a perimeter around my trailer, and figures in Arctic gear were approaching with what looked like cutting tools and electronic equipment. They weren't trying to steal my truck. They were trying to access my cargo without breaking the official seals. One of the figures was kneeling beside my trailer, working on something underneath. I could see sparks flying, suggesting they were using cutting tools on the trailer floor. They were creating access from below, where casual inspection wouldn't reveal the tampering. I had maybe 10 minutes before they completed their work and discovered that I wasn't in my truck. When they realized I was in the building, they would either try to eliminate me as a witness or abandon the operation entirely. Either way, my chances of survival were minimal if I stayed trapped in the truck stop. But my truck contained evidence of whatever illegal operation was using Arctic Supply Solutions as a front. If I could get to my trailer and document what they were doing, if I could get radio contact with authorities, if I could survive long enough to report what I'd discovered, I slipped out the back door of the truck stop and worked my way through the darkness toward my rig. The figures were so focused on their work that they didn't notice me approaching from an unexpected angle. As I got closer, I could see that they had cut a hole in the bottom of my trailer and were removing boxes through the opening. But they weren't stealing the boxes. They were replacing them. The boxes being removed were identical in size and weight to the ones being installed, but the contents were obviously different. I could hear liquid sloshing in some of the containers being taken out, while the replacement boxes made different sounds when moved. Through the hole they'd cut, I could see into my cargo area for the first time since loading. What I saw made my blood freeze, and my hands shake so violently I nearly dropped my gun. The boxes that were supposed to contain construction materials were filled with human organs suspended in preservation fluid. Hearts, kidneys, livers, and other tissues packed in medical-grade containers and labeled with codes that looked like inventory numbers. But that wasn't the worst part. Some of the containers held complete hands and feet, obviously removed from recently deceased people, and in the corner of my trailer, partially hidden behind legitimate cargo, were 3 industrial coolers that I knew with sick certainty contained complete human bodies. I was hauling a cargo of human remains, stolen organs and body parts that were being transported to buyers in the oil field complexes of the North Slope. My truck had been turned into a mobile morgue, and I was an unwitting accomplice to what could only be described as industrial-scale human trafficking and organ harvesting. The figures working on my trailer had now removed most of the incriminating cargo and were installing replacement boxes that presumably contained the legitimate construction materials listed on my manifest. When they finished, there would be no evidence of what I'd been carrying, and I would complete my delivery to Deadhorse with no one knowing that my trailer had been used to transport human remains. But I'd seen too much. I knew what Arctic Supply Solutions was really shipping, and I could identify the people who were sanitizing the evidence. That made me a liability that would have to be eliminated before I could report what I'd discovered. I crawled back toward the truck stop, hoping to reach Sarah and the radio equipment before the cleanup crew finished their work. But as I approached the building, I saw more vehicles arriving, this time with headlights blazing and official-looking markings that I realized were fake Alaska State Trooper cars. The entire operation was more sophisticated than simple cargo theft. They had fake law enforcement vehicles, professional-grade equipment for accessing trailer cargo without breaking seals, and a logistics network that could coordinate operations across hundreds of miles of wilderness highway. But most disturbing was the realization that they had inside information about drivers, routes, and schedules that could only have come from someone with access to shipping company databases and DOT records. They knew exactly which trucks were carrying their illegal cargo, when those trucks would reach specific locations, and how to intercept them without attracting attention from real law enforcement. I was trapped between the truck stop and my rig, with fake troopers approaching from one direction and the cleanup crew working near my trailer. The wilderness on both sides of the highway offered no escape. The temperature was now -30 degrees, and anyone attempting to survive on foot in those conditions would die within hours. My only option was to get back to my truck, complete the documentation of what I'd seen, and try to radio for help from real authorities. But the fake troopers were now positioned between me and my rig, and they were obviously armed and prepared for resistance. I worked my way through the darkness, using parked vehicles and buildings for cover, until I reached a position where I could observe both my truck and the activities of the cleanup crew. They had nearly finished replacing the incriminating cargo with legitimate materials, and one of the fake troopers was approaching Sarah in the truck stop. The conversation was brief and obviously threatening. Sarah emerged from the building with her hands raised, and the fake trooper escorted her to one of the vehicles. She was being taken hostage to ensure her silence about whatever she had witnessed or heard. The cleanup operation was entering its final phase. Within minutes, they would complete the cargo substitution, eliminate the witnesses, and disappear into the Arctic wilderness. My truck would be found the next day with legitimate cargo and no evidence of the human trafficking operation. But they had made one crucial mistake. In their focus on eliminating evidence from my trailer, they had overlooked the fact that I had photographed some of the containers with my cell phone before approaching the truck. The images were stored in my phone's memory, providing proof of what Arctic Supply Solutions was really shipping to the North Slope. I also had audio recordings of my conversation with Sarah about the previous drivers who had discovered similar problems with their cargo. The recordings wouldn't be admissible in court, but they would provide investigators with leads that could expose the entire operation. The challenge was surviving long enough to get the evidence to legitimate authorities. I made my decision. Instead of trying to reach my truck or escape into the wilderness, I would hide until the cleanup crew left, then try to reach the radio equipment in the truck stop. If Sarah had managed to contact real state troopers before being captured, help might already be on the way. But as I settled into a hiding position behind a maintenance shed, I heard something that changed everything. One of the fake troopers was talking on a radio, coordinating with other units positioned along the Hall Road. "Base, this is Unit 7. Package delivery is complete at mile 175, moving to intercept targets at miles 200 and 250. Estimated completion time is 0400 hours. There were other drivers. Other trucks carrying illegal cargo were being intercepted at different locations along the highway. The operation I was witnessing was just one component of a much larger criminal enterprise that was using the Dalton Highway as a transportation corridor for human trafficking and organ harvesting. The scope was staggering. If they had units positioned every 25 to 50 miles along the highway, they could intercept dozens of trucks per night, replacing illegal cargo with legitimate materials and eliminating any drivers who discovered what they were really hauling. The radio chatter continued as the cleanup crews coordinated their activities. From what I could understand, the operation had been running for over 2 years, using multiple shipping companies as fronts and corrupting warehouse personnel to facilitate the loading of illegal cargo. But the most disturbing revelation was that the final destination for the human remains and organs wasn't buyers in the oil field complexes. The cargo was being transported to private aircraft at the Dead Horse airstrip, where it was being flown to unknown destinations outside Alaska. The Dalton Highway was being used as the first leg of an international human trafficking and organ smuggling network that stretched from remote villages in Alaska to buyers in countries where human life was valued in dollars rather than dignity. The fake trooper finished his radio conversation and began walking in my direction. I pressed myself against the maintenance shed and tried to control my breathing as his flashlight beam swept the area where I was hiding. "Anyone else in the area?" he called out to the cleanup crew. "Negative, the driver went into the truck stop when the lights went out. Should be with the woman." The fake trooper changed direction and headed toward the truck stop, apparently intending to collect me along with Sarah. When he discovered that I wasn't there, the search would intensify, and my hiding place behind the maintenance shed would be discovered quickly. I had maybe 5 minutes before they realized I was missing and began a systematic search of the area. 5 minutes to document whatever additional evidence I could gather, transmit a distress signal, and prepare for what would probably be my final confrontation with people who viewed human life as a commodity, to be harvested and sold. I used my phone to photograph the vehicles, the equipment, and the faces of the cleanup crew members. The images were automatically uploaded to cloud storage, ensuring that the evidence would survive, even if my phone was destroyed or taken. I also activated an emergency beacon that would transmit my location to search and rescue services. The signal was weak and might not reach anyone for hours, but it was the only chance I had of summoning legitimate help to Coldfoot. The fake trooper had reached the truck stop and was obviously searching for me. Through the windows, I could see him checking rooms and storage areas, becoming increasingly agitated as he realized that I wasn't where I was supposed to be. Within minutes, he emerged from the building and began coordinating a search with the cleanup crew. Flashlight beams began sweeping the parking lot, the maintenance areas, and the perimeter of the truck stop complex. I had one advantage. I knew the layout of Coldfoot better than they did, having stopped there regularly for over 2 decades. There were storage buildings, maintenance sheds, and equipment areas that weren't visible from the main parking lot. If I could reach the communications equipment in the maintenance facility, I might be able to contact real authorities. But first, I needed to sabotage their operation in a way that would prevent them from completing the cargo substitution and eliminating the evidence. If they could finish their work and disappear into the wilderness, my survival would be meaningless, because no one would believe my account of what I'd witnessed. The solution was obvious and terrifying. I would have to destroy my own truck. The cargo in my trailer now contained legitimate construction materials, but the cleanup crew's vehicles still held the human remains and organs they had removed. If I could create enough damage and chaos to prevent them from disposing of that evidence, investigators would eventually find proof of the trafficking operation. I worked my way through the darkness until I reached a position near the fuel storage tanks that supplied the truck stop. The tanks contained thousands of gallons of diesel fuel and gasoline, enough explosive potential to create a disaster that would be visible for miles and would definitely attract the attention of every emergency responder in northern Alaska. But destroying the fuel storage would also endanger Sarah and potentially kill innocent people who might be in the area. I needed a more targeted approach that would eliminate the evidence in the criminals' vehicles without causing unnecessary casualties. The answer was in my truck's emergency equipment. Every commercial vehicle was required to carry flares, fire extinguishers, and other safety devices that could be used as improvised weapons if necessary. If I could reach my truck and access the emergency equipment without being detected, the fake trooper was now coordinating the search by radio, directing the cleanup crew to check specific areas while he maintained overwatch from a central position. Their search pattern was systematic but predictable, creating brief opportunities to move between hiding places without being detected. I waited until the searchers were focused on the far side of the truck stop complex, then sprinted across open ground to my truck. The cleanup crew had finished their work and closed the hole they'd cut in the trailer floor, but their vehicles were still parked nearby, with the incriminating cargo inside. I reached my truck's emergency equipment compartment and extracted 3 highway flares and a small fire extinguisher. The flares burned at over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit and could ignite most materials on contact, if I could place them strategically in the criminals' vehicles. But as I prepared to move toward the cleanup crew's trucks, I heard the fake trooper's radio crackle with an urgent message. Unit 7, this is base. Abort current operation immediately. Real state troopers are en route to your location. Estimated arrival time 15 minutes. Extract all personnel and evidence. Repeat, abort immediately. Someone had gotten through to legitimate authorities. Whether it was Sarah before she was captured, or my emergency beacon, or some other source, real help was finally coming to Coldfoot. But 15 minutes was enough time for the criminals to load their evidence and disappear into the wilderness. The fake troopers and cleanup crew were already moving with military precision, loading the containers of human remains into their vehicles and preparing to evacuate. I had to delay them long enough for the real state troopers to arrive. The highway flares were my only weapons against vehicles that could outrun and outgun anything I could bring to bear. I lit the first flare and threw it into the cab of the nearest cleanup truck. The magnesium ignition created instant fire that spread rapidly through the vehicle's interior, producing smoke and flames that would be visible for miles. The second flare landed in the back of a pickup truck that contained several containers of human organs. The preservation chemicals ignited immediately, creating a toxic fire that forced the cleanup crew to abandon their vehicles and retreat to safe distances. But the fake trooper had spotted my location and was moving to intercept me. I could see the muzzle flash of his weapon as he fired at my position, bullets sparking off metal surfaces and shattering glass around me. I rolled behind my truck's trailer and lit the third flare, but before I could throw it, I felt a burning pain in my left shoulder. The fake trooper's bullet had found its target, sending me spinning against my truck's mud flaps. The wound wasn't immediately fatal, but it was bleeding heavily and making it difficult to use my left arm. I still had the lit flare in my right hand, and I could hear the fake trooper approaching my position to finish what he'd started. I waited until I could hear his footsteps just around the corner of my trailer, then rolled out and threw the flare directly at his feet. The magnesium fire caught his Arctic gear immediately, forcing him to drop his weapon and try to extinguish the flames that were consuming his clothing. But the other cleanup crew members were still functional and armed. They had regrouped around their remaining vehicles and were preparing to eliminate me before the real authorities arrived. I was wounded, outnumbered, and trapped in open ground with minimal cover. That's when I heard the most beautiful sound in the world. The distinct whine of turbine engines approaching from the south. Alaska State Troopers flying helicopter patrols along the Hall Road, responding to whatever distress signal had alerted them to the situation at Coldfoot. The helicopter's searchlight illuminated the truck stop parking lot like artificial daylight, revealing the burning vehicles, the armed figures, and my position behind my trailer. A loudspeaker crackled with official authority. "This is Alaska State Troopers. Drop your weapons and move away from the vehicles. The area is surrounded." Most of the cleanup crew surrendered immediately, recognizing that escape was impossible with helicopter support overhead. But the fake trooper, still smoldering from the flare attack, made one last attempt to eliminate the primary witness to their operation. He had retrieved his weapon and was taking aim at my position when the helicopter's searchlight blinded him. The moment of confusion was enough for me to draw my .44 Magnum and put 3 rounds center mass into his chest. He dropped like a stone, his finger still on the trigger of his rifle. The shooting stopped as the remaining criminals realized that resistance was futile. Within minutes, real state troopers were on the ground, securing the scene and beginning the process of documenting what would become one of the largest human trafficking and organ smuggling cases in Alaska history. But the immediate crisis was far from over. The containers that I'd helped ignite were still burning, releasing toxic fumes from the chemical preservatives and human tissues they contained. Emergency responders had to evacuate the area until hazmat teams could contain the chemical fire and safely dispose of the evidence. Sarah was found unharmed in one of the criminals' vehicles, but she was severely traumatized by witnessing the execution-style murders of 2 truck stop customers who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. The fake troopers had killed them to eliminate witnesses, demonstrating the ruthless efficiency of their operation. The investigation that followed revealed the scope of the criminal enterprise. Arctic Supply Solutions was indeed a front company, but it was just one of dozens of shipping companies that had been infiltrated by the trafficking network. The organization had been operating for over 5 years, using the remote highways of Alaska as transportation corridors for human remains harvested from victims across the Pacific Northwest. The human organs were being sold to buyers in countries where transplant regulations were minimal, and wealthy patients were willing to pay premium prices for organs of questionable origin. But the complete bodies were being used for even more disturbing purposes: medical experimentation, anatomical training, and ritualistic practices that investigators refused to describe in detail. Detective Lieutenant Sarah Chen, who headed the Alaska State Police investigation, estimated that over 300 people had been murdered to supply the trafficking network with organs and body parts. The victims were primarily homeless individuals, drug addicts, and other people whose disappearances wouldn't attract immediate attention from law enforcement. "What you discovered at Coldfoot," she told me during one of our interviews, was the final link in a supply chain that stretched from murder scenes in Seattle and Portland to buyers in countries where human organs are treated as commodities. The medical treatment for my gunshot wound was successful, but the psychological trauma of discovering that I'd been unknowingly transporting human remains took months to process. The knowledge that my truck had been used as a mobile morgue, that I'd been an unwitting accomplice to mass murder, created nightmares that no amount of therapy could completely eliminate. But the evidence I'd gathered, the photographs, the audio recordings, the eyewitness testimony, was crucial for prosecuting the criminal enterprise. Federal prosecutors were able to trace the network back to its origins in organized crime syndicates that operated across multiple countries. The trials lasted over 2 years and resulted in convictions that dismantled one of the largest human trafficking operations in North American history. But investigators warned that similar networks were still operating, using different transportation methods and different cover stories to move their gruesome cargo. The trucking industry's response was mixed and largely inadequate. Some companies implemented enhanced cargo inspection procedures and background checks for warehouse personnel, but others viewed the trafficking scandal as an isolated incident that didn't justify expensive security measures. The divide became apparent when I tried to return to hauling freight on the Dalton Highway after recovering from my injuries. Progressive companies offered enhanced security protocols, sealed trailer monitoring, and comprehensive background checks for all cargo handling personnel. But traditional companies continued operating with the same procedures that had allowed the trafficking network to flourish. I eventually found work with Arctic Transport Solutions, a company that specialized in high-security freight and understood the unique vulnerabilities of remote highway transportation. They implemented cargo inspection procedures that would have detected the human remains in my original load, and they provided drivers with communication equipment that couldn't be jammed by criminal organizations. But the whole road was never the same for me after that February night at Coldfoot. Every load became suspect, every shipper required verification, and every mile of highway held the possibility that my trailer contained cargo that no human being should have to transport. The memories of opening those containers and seeing human organs suspended in preservation fluid haunted my dreams for years. The knowledge that I'd been carrying complete human bodies, harvested from murder victims and destined for buyers who viewed human life as raw material, created a level of trauma that no amount of counseling could fully address. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, the psychologist who treated me for post-traumatic stress, explained that my symptoms were consistent with what combat veterans experience after witnessing atrocities. "You didn't just discover criminal activity," she said. "You uncovered evidence of systematic dehumanization on a scale that most people can't comprehend." But the therapy also helped me understand that my survival and testimony had prevented hundreds of additional murders. The trafficking network had been expanding its operations when I discovered their use of Arctic supply solutions, and my evidence had stopped them before they could implement plans to increase their harvest of human organs. The knowledge that I'd helped save lives provided some meaning to the trauma, but it couldn't erase the images of human body parts packed like merchandise in containers designed for legitimate cargo. Those images remained burned into my memory, surfacing during quiet moments when my guard was down. I became an advocate for enhanced cargo security in the trucking industry, speaking at conferences and training seminars about the vulnerabilities that criminal organizations could exploit. The message was always the same. Drivers needed to inspect their cargo, verify the legitimacy of their shippers, and report suspicious activities immediately. But I also emphasized that cargo inspection wasn't just about protecting freight. It was about ensuring that trucks weren't being used to transport victims of human trafficking, drug smuggling, or other criminal enterprises that treated human beings as commodities. The presentation always included photographs from the Coldfoot incident, not the gruesome images of human remains, but pictures of the fake law enforcement vehicles, the professional equipment used by the cleanup crews, and the sophisticated methods they'd employed to access trailer cargo without breaking seals. Audiences were often shocked by the level of organization and resources that criminal enterprises could bring to bear against the trucking industry. The trafficking network hadn't been composed of desperate criminals acting on impulse. They were professional operatives with military-style training, advanced equipment, and intelligence capabilities that rivaled law enforcement agencies. The education process was slow and often frustrating. Many truckers preferred to believe that cargo theft was limited to valuable merchandise, not the transportation of human remains and victims of violent crime. They couldn't accept that their trucks might be used as mobile morgues, or that legitimate shipping companies could be infiltrated by criminal organizations. But the drivers who embraced enhanced inspection procedures proved more effective at detecting suspicious cargo. They found evidence of drug smuggling, weapons trafficking, and even additional cases of human organ transportation that led to arrests and prosecutions across multiple states. The informal network of security-conscious drivers became increasingly valuable to law enforcement agencies investigating organized crime. We developed communication protocols, shared intelligence about suspicious activities, and coordinated responses when criminal operations were detected. My role in the network evolved from victim to coordinator, using my experience with the trafficking network to help other drivers recognize signs of cargo tampering and criminal infiltration of shipping companies. The work was dangerous but essential. Every criminal operation we detected potentially saved lives and prevented atrocities, but the network also made me a target for revenge attacks from criminal organizations whose operations we had disrupted. Intelligence sources suggested that I was on target lists for several groups that viewed my activities as threats to their profitable human trafficking enterprises. The threat assessments were sobering but not surprising. By helping other drivers detect suspicious cargo, I was reducing the success rates of criminal enterprises that depended on truckers' ignorance and complacency. By coordinating intelligence sharing among drivers, I was making it more difficult for trafficking networks to operate with impunity. 5 years after the Coldfoot incident, I received a call from Detective Chen informing me that investigators had discovered another trafficking network using similar methods on highways in the lower 48. This time, the criminal organization was more sophisticated and had adapted their procedures to counter the security measures that had been implemented after the Alaska investigation. "We need your expertise," she said. "You understand how these networks operate, what vulnerabilities they exploit, and how to detect their activities before they can eliminate witnesses and evidence." The request was both an honor and a burden. An honor because it recognized that my survival and testimony had produced valuable intelligence that could be used to save other lives. A burden because it meant that the war against human trafficking was ongoing, with new networks emerging as fast as old ones were dismantled. But I accepted the assignment without hesitation. The truckers who would become unknowing accomplices to the new trafficking network deserved the same chance at discovering the truth that I'd had. They deserved to know that someone was watching for signs of criminal infiltration, developing countermeasures, and willing to fight back against people who viewed human organs as merchandise. The investigation lasted 18 months and resulted in arrests that prevented what federal prosecutors described as one of the largest organ trafficking operations ever attempted in the United States. Over 500 potential victims were saved, and a criminal network with connections to organized crime syndicates in 6 countries was dismantled. But the investigation also revealed that the trafficking networks were evolving faster than our defensive capabilities. New criminal organizations were entering the human trafficking business, developing more sophisticated methods for accessing transportation systems and targeting broader segments of the trucking industry. The war would continue, with new battles being fought on every highway where freight moved between cities and states. The methods would become more subtle, the criminal organizations more sophisticated, and the stakes higher as traffickers realized that the transportation industry was their most vulnerable point of exposure. But the war could also be won by ordinary truckers who understood the threats and implemented appropriate countermeasures. Every driver who learned cargo inspection procedures, every company that enhanced security protocols, and every law enforcement agency that took trafficking seriously was contributing to a defensive network that made criminal operations more difficult and expensive. The cargo that had been missing from my trailer on the Dalton Highway was supposed to remain missing, hidden evidence of mass murder that would never be discovered by law enforcement. Instead, it became the foundation for a career in counter-trafficking work that may have saved thousands of lives and prevented countless atrocities. The highway through the Arctic wilderness still calls to me, despite everything that happened on that February night when I discovered that cargo theft could involve human body parts instead of valuable merchandise. The haul road remains one of the most challenging and dangerous highways in North America, essential for Alaska's economy and energy security. But I never drive that highway without remembering that predators can be patient, sophisticated, and virtually undetectable until their crimes are discovered by drivers who understand that cargo inspection is about more than protecting freight. Since that night, every seal gets checked, every manifest gets verified, and every shipper gets investigated before I accept a load. The vigilance is exhausting and expensive, but it's also the only thing standing between the trucking industry and people who view human trafficking as a profitable business model. The Dalton Highway remains a hunting ground for criminal organizations that understand the vulnerability of isolated drivers hauling freight through hundreds of miles of wilderness. But it also contains a network of drivers who understand the threats, implement effective countermeasures, and refuse to be unwitting accomplices to atrocities that wearing human faces. The missing cargo from my trailer wasn't just stolen merchandise. It was evidence of systematic murder, designed to supply an international market for human organs and body parts. The replacement cargo wasn't just construction materials. It was a cover story designed to conceal crimes that treated human beings as raw materials to be harvested and sold. But the criminals made one crucial mistake. They assumed that truckers were too focused on schedules and profit margins to investigate suspicious cargo or report unusual activities to authorities. They underestimated the capacity of ordinary drivers to recognize evil and fight back with everything they had. The war continues every day on every highway, with every load that might contain more than what's listed on the manifest. Criminal organizations are constantly developing new methods for exploiting transportation systems, infiltrating legitimate companies, and using unwitting drivers to transport victims and evidence of violent crimes. But the war can be won by truckers who understand that cargo inspection isn't just about protecting freight. It's about ensuring that our trucks aren't being used as mobile morgues, that our trailers aren't transporting victims of human trafficking, and that our profession isn't being corrupted by people who view human life as a commodity to be bought and sold. The night I discovered that part of my cargo was missing taught me that some thefts aren't about taking valuable merchandise. They're about replacing evidence of murder with legitimate freight, turning trucks into unwitting accomplices to atrocities that should never see daylight. Since then, every missing seal, every unexplained weight change, and every suspicious shipper gets treated as a potential sign that someone is trying to use my truck to transport horrors that no human being should have to carry. The highway through Alaska's wilderness taught me that predators can be patient, organized, and sophisticated enough to infiltrate legitimate businesses and corrupt honest drivers. But it also taught me that those same predators can be stopped by truckers who refuse to ignore the warning signs and who understand that sometimes the most important cargo you carry is the courage to investigate when something doesn't feel right. My cargo had been missing from the trailer, but I found something more valuable in its place: the knowledge that ordinary drivers can make extraordinary differences in the fight against human trafficking and organized crime. That knowledge has become my most important freight, carried on every run, delivered to every driver willing to listen, and shared with every law enforcement agency that understands the crucial role truckers play in recognizing and stopping the transportation of human misery. The Dalton Highway stretches 414 miles through some of the most remote and dangerous terrain in North America. But somewhere along those miles, in truck stops and rest areas where evil thinks it can operate with impunity, ordinary truckers are conducting cargo inspections that could save lives and expose crimes that stretch across international borders. The missing cargo taught me that sometimes what's not in your trailer is more important than what is, and that the courage to investigate empty spaces might be the only thing standing between civilization and people who harvest human organs like farmers harvest crops. Since that February night, I've never stopped looking for what's missing. Because in the freight business, empty space can be filled with horrors beyond imagination, and the only defense is drivers who understand that cargo inspection is ultimately about protecting human dignity in a world where some people view it as negotiable. The road taught me its most important lesson in the Arctic darkness. Sometimes the most dangerous cargo isn't what you can see. It's what's been replaced, removed, or hidden in spaces that aren't supposed to exist. And sometimes the most valuable discovery you make isn't about what you're carrying, but about what someone tried to make disappear before you could find it. Every missing piece of cargo since then has been treated as a potential crime scene, because I learned that night that empty spaces in trailers can hold evidence of atrocities, and that the silence of missing freight can scream louder than any alarm about crimes that treat human beings as merchandise to be packaged, shipped, and sold. The missing cargo from my trailer on the Dalton Highway wasn't just theft. It was attempted murder on an industrial scale, with my truck as the unwitting weapon and my ignorance as the ammunition. But knowledge is the ultimate defense against such weapons, and since that night, I've been armed with the understanding that cargo inspections are ultimately inspections of human conscience. To every driver who learns to look for what's missing, every company that implements procedures for detecting cargo substitution, and every law enforcement agency that takes trafficking seriously is contributing to a defensive network that makes it harder for criminals to use transportation systems as tools for human exploitation. The war against trafficking networks continues, but it can be won by ordinary truckers who understand that sometimes the most important thing you haul isn't freight at all. It's the vigilance to recognize when your truck is being used to transport horrors, and the courage to fight back when you discover that part of your cargo is missing. because it's been replaced with evidence of crimes against humanity. The Dalton Highway taught me that some roads lead through darkness so complete that only the light of human conscience can illuminate the path forward, and sometimes that light reveals that what's missing from your cargo is more important than what's present, because empty spaces can be filled with evil, and the only defense is drivers who refuse to ignore the silence where screams should be heard.